different PR bodies internally to the DND. In 2012, they monitored 29,519 newspaper articles. They compiled information on what reporters have reported, who's sympathetic, who should we release information to. They obviously have dozens of their own publications. They spend tens of millions of dollars in recruitment, much of which is effectively sort of pro-war propaganda. They do all kinds of cultural celebrations that people I'm sure are very familiar with. Spend millions, tens of millions of dollars, air shows, going to hockey games, etc., etc. But it goes way beyond just sort of like what we'd consider like normal PR or cultural outreach. They have a historical section, right? For a century, there's been a historical section of the military, more than 25 employees, that for the first half century, so into the 1960s, they wrote almost all the books about Canadian military history, were being written as official histories that actually had to get okayed by cabinet. And there's actually instances where cabinet were like, no, you got to change that, right? We don't want that to be published. These were official histories that, again, had to be okayed by cabinet. Many of the early academics, and this goes into the 60s and 70s, many of the academics dealing with security matters at Canadian universities, they began as official historians of the Canadian military. And the historical section of the DND is still not as influential, but is still an influential force in academic life. There's many arm's-length military organizations like the Royal Canadian Military Institute, which office is a couple of blocks away from here, I believe. Groups like the Legion, Conference of Defense Associations, Canadian Global Affairs Institute, Canadian Institute for Strategic Studies. These are arm's-length organizations of the Canadian military. They usually receive funding indirectly or directly from the military, from the arms manufacturers. And that's many of the voices you hear quoted in the dominant media around military affairs, many international issues. They're quoting people from these arm's-length think tanks, arms-length military think tanks. And I detail all this in the book in many ways. The military also has a program to directly influence academic departments. Security Defense Forum goes back to 1967. Funds over a dozen security studies programs at Canadian universities. Right? Many of the security studies, York's security studies, it began with funding from the military, from the Security Defense Forum.
3 minutes.
Right. So these departments at ostensibly public universities that are about debating issues, you find if you start looking into it, many of these programs have ties to the Security Defense Forum that spends millions of dollars in universities. But it goes way beyond the military, and I go into it in the book. In terms of the universities, right? So the propaganda system I'm outlining is broader than just the dominant media. There are many facets. There's the think tanks. There's the PR of government bodies. There's the academia, etc. I mean, take a look at universities, right? How much of international related departments universities are funded by wealthy people, corporate interests? So in 2010, U of T received $5.3 million from the Saudi king to set up the Chair for Dialogue Among Civilizations. Right? Qatar in 2012 gave McGill's Institute of Islamic Studies $1.25 million. David Esraeli, somebody who fought with the Haganah in 1948 in ethnic cleansing of Palestine, gave $5 million to Concordia to set up the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies, which Gerald Steinberg, a noted anti-Palestinian, referred to as a counterattack against Palestinian solidarity activism at Concordia. I go into all kinds of other examples of the wealthy people funding international affairs-related departments at university. But just two important ones. The one I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with is the Munk School of Global Affairs at U of T. Right next door. Among the least credible people to be funding a School of Global Affairs in this country would be Peter Munk, right? This is founder and longtime CEO of a company that's pillaging all around the world, benefiting Canadian foreign policy, and an extreme right-wing ideologue. He's put up a huge amount of money for the Munk School of Global Affairs, which is, in fact, mostly the money comes from our pockets. He's been able to but he provides money which he gets a tax credit for, and most of it actually is public money, so that he gets to control the political direction of this public money. The oldest school of global affairs in this country, the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, at Carleton, it was set up with funding by Norman Paterson, who was a senator very close to Lester Pearson. And the first head of Norman Paterson School of International Affairs was Norman Robertson, who was a top diplomat, second in charge of external affairs, and actually continued to be paid by external affairs when he headed up the new School of Global Affairs at Carleton. And that school, as I go through in the book, has continued to have very close ties with the diplomatic service in Ottawa. That's again the most one of the oldest and one of the most influential schools of international affairs. Now, going into a further area, even if you're looking at international development studies at Canadian universities, you find that CEDA, Canadian Aid Agency, has been the primary source of funding for those programs. That, of course, lessens the criticism of CEDA policy, Canadian aid policy, Canadian foreign policy. Now, I'll just end it on one final point about, I think, a rule of foreign policy that you won't hear about Canadian foreign policy, you won't hear in almost any places except from a talk that I give, which is that the more impoverished a nation, the greater the gap is likely to be between what Canadian officials say and do. Right? So the weaker and more impoverished the place is, the bigger the lies Canadian officials can tell us about what they're doing in that place. The clearest example of it is in Haiti. Right? Basically, we overthrow a government, we install, in 2004, install unelected government, kills thousands of people. Our aid dollars go to the coup officials, like literally the second in charge of the Justice Ministry is an official of our aid agency and others, responsible for the political prisoners for much of the killing. That's aid money. That's us helping, right? In popular discussion, it's our benevolence is literally going to the torturers of the majority poor in Haiti. Right? And so this is, and when you ask the question, why? Right? Because what power do Haitians have, the majority poor in Haiti, to shape what we hear about what's going on in Haiti versus what power does Ottawa, Paris, Washington have in shaping what's going on in Haiti? They have, the PR budget of our military is more than the whole national government budget of the Haitian government. So you have just incredible imbalance of power, and that allows for the politicians to lie beyond belief. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. Okay, Jeff. Okay, get the microphone for him.
Okay.
Hi there. Did we get the title of the book you were referring to?
Yeah, propaganda. I have copies back there if you're interested.
Okay, thank you.
For sale.
Testing. Hello again. I'm really going to enjoy this talk. I'm going to make you so mad. Let me start by really making you mad. How many of you have seen the movie The Truman Show? How many know what a Potemkin village is? We live in The Truman Show. That was the point of the movie. It's an artificial, fake world created by the capitalist class. Jim Carrey played in this very serious movie the only character on an island created by a media magnate who didn't know that from the day he was born until the day he discovers it, he was on television as the lead character. Everything around him was an invention. Every store, his wife, his friends, his next door neighbors, the phobia that they created in him, his idiosyncrasies, his job was all fake. And you all live in a Truman Show world. There is nothing in the capitalist media that is true. I say this just to get you mad. Because you know, when the Warriors play Toronto, they give the score properly. But let me be serious about this. If you look at the literature table there, socialist action literature, it comes from the point of view of the working class. If you look at the entire corporate media, corporate ideology, it comes from the view of the ruling class. The dominant ideology is the class in power, and they create the image of themselves that they want. Donald Trump was elected president, and what irks the ruling class, because 56 out of 56 major newspapers in the country supported Hillary Clinton, not Donald Trump. Donald Trump tore off the thin veneer of civilization that is glued onto American imperialist society to make you think you live in a rational, civilized world.
I never thought that.
What'd you say?
I never thought that.
You in general. So let me give you one example. Today's headline of the New York Times, hackers use tool taken from National Security Administration in global attack. These hackers affected 72 nations, but they got the information, they got the technology from the NSA and the FBI. WikiLeaks revealed that the NSA and the FBI, they released the largest trove of NSA and FBI documents in the history of the world, showing how the NSA used cyber war to intervene in everyone's computer, in your television set, even if you turn it off. It's a fake off, it's really on, photographing you, if you're a Samsung user. And it shows how they use cyber war, special operations war, and every kind of technological war to spy on everyone, everywhere, every cable system, everything in Google, Facebook, you name it, they do it. And they do it, they call it malware. I don't know if you know, mal means bad stuff, you know. They do it to speed up the computers in Iran and blow them up so they can't refine uranium for any use. They do it to spy on every country in the world. And they even, according to the New York Times, which only released it after WikiLeaks made it public, they have malware to imitate Russian hackers. So it comes out as Russian, but it's American. So there is nothing in the New York Times or any other paper in the country that is true from the point of view of the working class. Nothing. Let me give you some examples. Libya. We had to invade Libya because Gaddafi was going to kill 50,000 people in Benghazi, right? Years later, the British intelligence said there was never any threat to the people of Benghazi. And who was we that invaded? We didn't invade. We got the entire NATO to bomb the country to smithereens, destroy its entire infrastructure based on the lie of Benghazi. We destroyed the country. Then we got 57 or 46 people and we made them a parliament. We still couldn't liberate it, so we liberated with Qatari troops. What's the capital city of, Tripoli was liberated by Qatari troops. There were no Benghazi troops. And Qatari troops are trained in Qatar at the Blackwater-based privatized army, death squad, private army funded by the US government to protect the Qatari monarchy and use as a base for US invasion all over the Middle East. So Libya was destroyed, reduced to ruin. They call it a failed state. It was US imperialism's failed state because they wanted control over the oil. They have 5% of the resources in the country. And every single thing they said was a lie. And they destroyed that country. What about Egypt? There was a massive mobilization in Egypt, a popular mobilization against a 38-year-old dictatorship, US-backed Mubarak, the second largest recipient of US military aid in the world. They had an election and the Mubarak candidate didn't win. Mohammed Morsi won the election. And then we are treated to the Tamarun Rebellion. How many know what that was? Well, you should have, because every paper in the country blasted that 5,000 people, 10,000, 50,000, a million, 2 million, 10 million, 24 million people signed a petition asking the president to resign. And the numbers kept changing all the time. The demonstration started at 300,000 against Morsi. They ended up with 24 million because the bureaucrats who created the news had to have more people in the street than actually voted for Morsi. And then with total US backing, they overthrew the government, murdered 12,000 of Morsi's supporters, and established al-Sisi as the president of the country. And when it came to the United States, we were in a dilemma because American law says you're not allowed to give money to a coup government that comes to power through dictatorship. So they called in the expert on these things. What was the Attorney General's name at the time?
Holder.
Who?
Holder.
Yeah, Eric Holder. And they said, well, you're the chief legal officer. Is it legal for us to continue giving $3 billion a year to Egypt? And he just wrote up a paper saying, sure, that wasn't really a military coup that killed 12,000 people instantly. These are modern examples, and Syria is the brightest example. But let's go into a few others. President Bill Clinton apologized to the people of Guatemala for killing 400,000 people during the Central American US-backed dictatorship that slaughtered the indigenous people of that country. He said, I'm sorry, it was a mistake. The CIA trained them. The United States invaded Iraq on the pretext that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, right? And they killed 1.5 million Iraqis. 1.5 by a mistake. And both Hillary and Donald said, yeah, that was a mistake. Can you imagine? Seriously saying, we killed 1.5 million. It was just a mistake. Was it a mistake, or was it the policy of that country? We're talking about North Korea. Every day, the newspapers report that this is a dictatorship. This is the boy king, the boy dictator. What they don't say is during the Korean War, a week before it started, Syngman Rhee, the Princeton University educated dictator of that country, for a decade slaughtered 300,000 communists in 1945, I believe it was July. And then began sending troops across the border. The pretext invented was that 50,000 North Koreans invaded the South, and the United States bombed that country to smithereens. There wasn't a building left standing in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, and 4 million North Koreans were slaughtered. You don't hear about that. 37,000 American boys died in that war. How about Vietnam? Those damn Vietnamese attacked with sampans, patrol boats, U.S. destroyers at Tonkin Bay, justifying a 10-year war that killed 4 million Vietnamese and leveled their cities. Genocidal war. Genocidal war. In the history of the United States in the last 150 years, 100 years roughly, they have invaded, there have been 150 wars. Each one of them had a pretext. Remember the Maine? What country was that?
Spain.
Cuba. The Cubans were, bombed a obsolete, burned out ship, and they invaded Cuba and took over the country. 150 invasions, and each one had a pretext that was blasted in the corporate media as a justification for U.S. imperialist conquest, slaughter, and so on. In Syria, there was a legitimate uprising of people, peasants in particular, who the drought had reduced to terrible conditions and crop failed, and the government refused to give relief. Young people came into the streets and protested the attacks on civil liberties. Within weeks, those mass mobilizations were supported by U.S. imperialism. The FSA was a creation, previous speaker said, of Turkey, of U.S. imperialism. And the entire imperialist world decided they were going to take down Bashar Assad exactly the way they took down Morsi in Egypt, exactly the way they took down Gaddafi and every other country. Syria is not the one exception in the world. The rebels are a fake creation by U.S. imperialism. The United States spent $1 billion a year arming and financing troops to fight against Assad. They turned protest demonstrations by peasants and students into a war of imperialist conquest. 6 years. Where it's in its 7th year. And to this day, I have not heard the name of one rebel organization. Not one with a program in the interest of the Syrian people. The New York Times' Ann Bernard is the most prolific reporter, and she constantly reports, if you read between the lines at the end of her articles, that the so-called rebels are embedded with the ISIS and Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front in Syria. That is the US, Saudi-financed, Qatari-financed, Bahrain-financed terrorist groups of Sunni origin. And yet all you hear every day of the week is we, United States, has to get rid of Bashar Assad. What gives us the right to intervene anywhere in any country at any time? What were we doing on the other side of the world in Vietnam? President Obama visited Laos after his China summit meeting and apologized to the Laotian people for dropping 260 million bombs on the country during the Vietnam War. Did you ever hear that before? 260 million bombs destroyed the infrastructure of that country. And those bombs are still in the countryside, and kids running through the fields are still getting blown up. And nobody mentioned, we didn't declare war. We just didn't want, quote, all Southeast Asia to go communist. So we bombed Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and slaughtered millions. That's the record of imperialist conquest. We portray Trump as a monster, and he is. But what about Obama? He's conducting 7 simultaneous wars openly, not to mention backing the Saudis' slaughter in Yemen, which is a genocide. The U.S. bombing, you never hear about it, in Mosul has been declared by United Nations Committee to be genocide, saturation bombing cities and reducing them to ruin. The history of American imperialism has been covered up so well. Did you ever hear Alan Greenspan?
Yeah.
He was the head of the Federal Reserve of the United States. He wrote a 1,000-page book, and in it there's a little chapter on Iran. And, you know, it's 50 years later since the United States overthrew the Iranian democratic elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, and they installed the Shah of Iran. And he said, well, you know, how did we justify it, said Alan Greenspan, representative, spokesperson of the U.S. ruling. He says the 800-pound gorilla in the room was that they were like second in the world in oil reserves, and we couldn't leave that untouched. So the Iranian people had a revolution in 1979 and overthrew the Shah. And the United States didn't like that, so they signed up Saddam Hussein to invade Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war that went on for years. Someone mentioned it. 1 million Iranians died in that US-funded war when we supported Saddam Hussein. It was only Ali North who blew the whistle because when the Iraqis started making some gains, the government of the United States decided to support the Khomeini regime, the other side, arm both sides, let them blow each other's oil wells up.
5 minutes.
And 800,000 Iraqis died in that war. 2 million people in a war orchestrated by US imperialism. You never heard about it. And Ali North is running around giving speaking engagements for $50,000 a shot. He's a hero. He was Ronald Reagan's hero. In Grenada, they overthrew that country because they said that the government was going to invade a medical school. And they removed the government of that country, leaving aside what happened between the Stalinist court and Maurice Bishop, who was a friend of mine. What about Obama? I said 7 in a row, 7 countries, not counting his secret operations wars, his drone wars, his sanction wars, his special operation wars. These take place in every country on earth. They go with impunity and they take out any opposition anywhere on the planet, and you don't even know it. That's American imperialism. You hear the hullabaloo about the corporate media who hates Trump on deportation, but Obama deported more people, immigrants, than any president in the history of the United States. 2.5 million people. You hear that Trump is going to abrogate the Paris Accords. They were worthless to start with, and President Obama has turned the United States into the world's largest exporter of natural gas. They have a glut with natural gas. He's the world's #1 fracker, which is qualitatively more dangerous to the climate, global warming, because it produces methane, not to mention poisons the water supply. Obama only temporarily banned, he gave hundreds and hundreds of permits for offshore drilling because they didn't need the oil and it was too expensive. The same thing with coal. It's too expensive to mine coal, so he passed a few laws restricting coal production. But they will come back as soon as imperialism needs it. Obama is the #1 polluter, and they blame it on Trump. On civil liberties, President Obama, a black man with a liquid tongue and a sweet face, projecting himself as an honest man, oversaw the most massive surveillance institutions in the history of the world. He spied on everyone. He did it in the name, as they all do, of national security. It's national security to take out this government, to take out the Egyptian government, to take out oil wells. It's all in the interests of the national security interests of the U.S. ruling class. What about the banks? They say that Goldman Sachs is now running the country. President Obama bailed out American corporations, according to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, to the tune of $32 trillion. That's the largest bailout in the history of the world. That's almost double the GDP of the entire United States. He saved capitalism. They just said, hey, Joe, print some money. And they ran up the printing presses because the United States has total control. It's the currency reserve of the world, so they can print all the shit they want in the bills and pay off the corporations and bail them out. You don't hear anybody in the ruling class complaining that the stock market has gone through the roof under Trump. Or Donald Trump, the fool that he is, submitted a one-page tax program.
1 minute, Jeff.
One page to modify like 70,000 pages of the tax code. And if you looked at the back of the page and you heated it up because it was made out of invisible ink, it said, fuck the working class, long live the ruling class. That's what the tax code is. Every single provision in there is to defend the interests of U.S. capital and screw the working class. We create all the wealth and we pay their bills. So we live truly in a Truman Show world, a fake world created by the ruling class. It's been that way from the beginning of time. The dominant ideology is the ideology created by the ruling class. Whether it be the slaveocracy, you hear their history, not the 99%, the feudal aristocracy, the dictators of the world, and now the capitalist class, who is in the deepest crisis ever. And all of the things that I mentioned are a product of a capitalism and a world system that cannot solve the interests, the needs of ordinary people. And they all collaborate in every trade agreement, including NAFTA, to manipulate all the statistics and the agreements to the advantage of the rich and the disadvantage of working people on every front. On the military front, to slaughter people; on the global warming front, to poison people; on the nuclear front, to threaten the extinction of the planet Earth. The United States is the only nation on Earth that dropped 2 bombs, instantly incinerating 250,000 people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and no American president has repudiated the use of atomic weapons. We have 5,000 nuclear warheads. They call them tactical weapons. They're only good for taking out a city of 8-10 million people. What kind of civilization do we live in a nation that contemplates the use of a nuclear war? Should we say, North Korea, you may have a nuclear weapon, even though 5 million people, 4 million people were slaughtered? You can't have one where imperialism can control the entire planet. We start with the proposition of unconditional, total, immediate, unilateral U.S. disarmament. That's the only guarantee. We stand for 100% renewable, not 99%, 100% renewable, otherwise the future of the planet becomes extinct. And capitalism cannot break from the profits of fossil fuel. And that's the central reason. If we don't make a revolution, we're going to die from nuclear war or from global warming that makes the planet intolerable, impossible to live in, or from endless wars for imperialist plunder. We do live in a fake world from A to Z, and we have to create the ideology of revolution, of class interests, of the 99%, as we say, in the Occupy movement, because that's who we fight for. And we can win them over because we fight in their interests. There is nothing contradictory between the program of socialist revolution and the interests of the vast majority of working people and all the oppressed around the world.
Bravo.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, we're going to open up the floor for questions and interventions.